At a glittering charity gala filled with billionaires and flashing cameras, Keanu Reeves walks in alone. No entourage, no luxury car, no ego. Moments later, whispers turn to laughter as young tycoons mock him in front of everyone. But by the end of the night, they'll wish they'd never opened their mouths. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The night sky above downtown Los Angeles shimmered with flashes of camera lights bouncing off polished cars and jeweled gowns. The grand entrance of the Horizon Hotel glowed like a scene from a dream. Luxury vehicles lined the curb, sleek black limousines, chrome sports cars, and limited edition sedans whose doors opened to reveal people who thrived on attention. Reporters called out names, microphones waved in the air, and the soft clicks of camera shutters never stopped. Everyone who mattered in the city's circle of wealth was there. CEOs, real estate heirs, and social media stars moved through the red carpet as though stepping into their natural habitat. Inside, the ballroom glittered like a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the marble floor, casting sparkles over champagne glasses and tailored suits. A live jazz band played near the corner, the saxophone melting into the laughter of guests who competed to outshine one another with stories of influence and fortune. It was the kind of night meant to be remembered, photographed, and bragged about the next morning. Then, in the middle of that chaos, a quiet engine pulled up by the valet line. No cameras turned this time. No one gasped. It was just an old, well-kept Ford truck. Its metallic blue paint faded but dignified, like something that had seen the world without needing to prove anything. Keanu Reeves stepped out, his black suit clean but simple, his shoes unpolished, his demeanor calm. He nodded to the valet, handed him the keys, and gave a small thank you that went unnoticed among the revving engines of sports cars. He walked through the lobby without fanfare. The doorman recognized him instantly, eyes widening in disbelief. It wasn't every day a movie icon walked in without an assistant, without a flash of ego or entourage. The man whispered a greeting, but Keanu only smiled back and patted his shoulder as he passed. He moved like someone used to silence, someone comfortable being unseen. As he reached the registration table, two young women working the check-in glanced up, startled to see him in person. One fumbled her papers, and the other whispered, "He's here. He actually came." Keanu nodded politely. "Good evening," he said softly. "I'm here for the Horizon Gala." They smiled nervously and handed him his name tag. There was no VIP label attached, no preferred table number. Just his name, Keanu Reeves, typed plainly on a thin white card. He took it with gratitude, thanked them again, and walked toward the ballroom doors. Around him, a few guests noticed and murmured. Some whispered that it couldn't be him. Others stared, confused by how plainly he dressed, how unguarded he seemed in a place built on pretense. A man in a white tux turned to his friend and said under his breath, "I thought he lived like a recluse. Guess he's trying to look humble now." Keanu didn't hear him, or maybe he did, and chose not to respond. He walked through the grand archway, into the glow of chandeliers and self-importance, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, that the night was about to test his quiet dignity in front of everyone watching. Inside the ballroom, the air carried a faint scent of roses, champagne, and expensive perfume. The room felt alive with the rhythm of polished conversation and practiced laughter. Every table gleamed under the soft golden light, each centerpiece more extravagant than the next vases of orchids, floating candles, crystal decanters. But as Keanu made his way toward the back, the sound of his quiet footsteps seemed almost out of place among the noise of self-promotion. He paused for a moment, observing the crowd. Rows of tuxedos and shimmering gowns filled the space like an ocean of vanity. A line of photographers circled the front tables, snapping pictures of the loudest guests, the kind who craved recognition more than the cause they had come to support. In the far corner, a large banner stretched across the wall. Horizon Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Building Futures for Underprivileged Youth. Beneath it stood a display of framed photos showing new schools and smiling children. Few people bothered to look at them. Keanu found his assigned seat table 28 near the back, next to a quiet elderly couple and a young server restocking glasses. The chatter at the main tables felt like another world entirely. He removed his jacket, folded it neatly over the chair, and offered a warm nod to the couple beside him. The woman recognized him immediately. "You're Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" she whispered. He smiled, gentle and humble. "Just Keanu's fine," he said. Her husband chuckled softly. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Keanu shrugged lightly. "The invitation was kind," he replied. "It's a good cause." At another table, several young businessmen noticed the exchange. Their tailored suits gleamed under the lights, watches flashing as they gestured with champagne glasses in hand. One of them, a man in his early 30s with slick back hair, turned to his group with a smirk. "Is that really Keanu Reeves?" he asked loudly. "I thought he'd be somewhere more exclusive." His friend leaned over, laughing. "Maybe he couldn't get into the main circle." The group chuckled, drawing attention from nearby guests. Keanu didn't turn his head. He lifted his glass of water, took a sip, and let the conversation pass through him like wind through an open window. The elderly couple beside him exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the disrespect in the air. Moments later, a waitress carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres tripped slightly near Keanu's table. Without hesitation, he stood and caught the tray before it could hit the floor. The woman gasped in relief. "Oh my gosh, thank you, sir." "It's all right," Keanu said kindly. "No harm done." He helped her steady herself before handing the tray back. At the businessmen's table, another round of laughter followed. "He's helping the help now," one of them muttered. "Playing the saint again, huh?" The remarks reached the waitress's ears, and she frowned in embarrassment. Keanu gave her a reassuring nod. "Don't worry about them," he said quietly. "Just keep doing what you do. You're part of what makes this night work." Her smile returned faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." He nodded again and sat back down, unaware that the evening had only begun to reveal its true nature. The evening program officially began as the MC welcomed guests from the grand stage. A string quartet played softly behind him, while waiters glided between tables, refilling champagne flutes and collecting empty plates. The atmosphere grew brighter, louder, almost feverish with wealth and pride. But at the far end of the hall, Keanu remained quiet, content to listen rather than be seen. He glanced toward the stage where a slideshow played a montage of children laughing, classrooms built through the Horizon Foundation, smiling families whose lives had been touched. Around him, a few people politely clapped between bites of steak. Most were too distracted, talking about real estate ventures, sports cars, or upcoming vacations. Keanu folded his hands, eyes resting on the images, a faint trace of sadness flickering across his face. He didn't belong to their world. Not really. He had come for something deeper. A new burst of laughter echoed across the room. The same group of young businessmen, Ryan Huxley, Derek, and their friends, had grown louder with every drink. Their confidence filled the space like smoke. "I heard Reeves sold most of his cars," Ryan sneered to the table. "Guess the Matrix didn't pay the bills." Derek grinned. "Maybe he's just trying to stay humble." That's what people say when they can't afford luxury anymore. Their laughter drew stares, but no one confronted them. Not yet. The words hung in the air, sharp enough to cut. The elderly woman beside Keanu shifted uncomfortably. Her husband muttered something about bad manners. Keanu only smiled faintly and whispered, "It's all right." He didn't defend himself. He never needed to. As the music softened and dessert arrived, the MC invited everyone to stand for a toast. Glasses clinked across the ballroom. The light shimmered on gold cutlery and diamond jewelry. In that glimmering moment, one could almost forget the cruelty hidden in laughter. Ryan lifted his glass, eyes glinting with arrogance. "Here's to success," he said loudly, "and to those who still dream of it." His table erupted in laughter again, the kind that sought attention more than humor. At the back, Keanu raised his glass of water quietly, not in response, but in gratitude for being there, for the cause that truly mattered. As he took a sip, Emily, the young journalist covering the event, caught sight of him from across the room. She frowned, noticing how the noise and arrogance seemed to circle him like a storm. She didn't know why, but something told her this quiet man would soon become the center of a night none of them would ever forget. And from Ryan's table came one final mocking line that sealed the tone for the rest of the evening. Guess not every star can afford first class anymore. The gala had reached its golden hour. The lights softened. The music settled into a gentle rhythm, and the conversations grew louder with every sip of champagne. The waitstaff moved swiftly between tables, refilling glasses, carrying trays of desserts that glittered under the chandeliers. Laughter rippled through the hall, but beneath it ran a quieter current, whispers that carried more venom than the guests' polished smiles could hide. At the center of it all, Ryan Huxley leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. The brash investor had built his reputation on arrogance and risk. He was young, rich, and completely unbothered by humility. His slicked hair, tailored suit, and diamond cufflinks gleamed with the kind of confidence that demanded attention. Tonight, he had plenty of it. His entourage, fellow businessmen, influencers, and corporate heirs hung on every word he said, laughing a little too loudly at every joke. Ryan's gaze drifted across the room until it landed once again on Keanu, sitting quietly near the back, talking softly with the elderly couple from earlier. He narrowed his eyes and let out a low whistle. "Would you look at that?" he said, tapping Derek's arm. Hollywood royalty, hiding in the cheap seats. Derek smirked, lifting his glass. Maybe he didn't get the memo about dress codes. What's that? A thrift store suit? The men around them chuckled. Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "He probably Ubered here," he said with mock seriousness. "Or maybe he took the bus, trying to stay grounded." The laughter grew louder. Heads from nearby tables turned, curious about the commotion. A few guests followed their gaze toward Keanu. Some shrugged it off. Others joined the whispering. The man who had arrived without fanfare was now the unspoken topic of the evening. Keanu sat calmly, unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring the noise around him. He was sipping water instead of wine, his posture relaxed but dignified. To anyone watching closely, there was no trace of discomfort. His serenity seemed to irritate the men more than any reaction could have. The waitress from earlier, the same one he had helped, passed by his table again. She gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you again for earlier," she said softly. "That tray would have been a disaster," Keanu smiled back. "Glad I was close enough to help." Ryan caught the exchange and rolled his eyes. "Of course," he muttered loudly enough for his table to hear. "He's playing the nice guy act again. St. Keanu saves the day," Derek snorted. "Maybe he's auditioning for another movie, The Kind Man at the charity dinner." The table roared with laughter. Their cruelty wasn't subtle anymore, it was deliberate. The kind meant to entertain themselves at someone else's expense. Keanu glanced in their direction briefly but said nothing. His silence only made them feel louder. A storm of arrogance was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it broke the surface. The irony was thick, the night's theme. Building futures for underprivileged youth had become little more than words on a banner while the privileged mocked the man who had quietly done more for that cause than anyone in the room. The laughter from Ryan's table carried far enough that nearby guests began to take notice. Some turned their heads, curious, others uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The air in that side of the ballroom changed. What had been light and lively now carried the weight of quiet tension. The jazz band continued to play, but even the melody seemed drowned beneath the growing murmur of gossip. Ryan leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You know what I don't get?" he said. "How someone like him keeps getting invited to these things. He doesn't even network. Look at him sitting there alone, drinking water, talking to the help. It's pathetic." Derek smirked. "Maybe he's one of those mystery donor types, the kind that shows up just to pretend he cares." Ryan laughed and tapped his fork against his glass as if to punctuate his words. He must be past his prime. Nobody relevant walks in without a car worth more than a house. The group laughed again. Their table became a small stage for mockery. Even as the MC returned to the microphone, introducing the evening's charity focus, the men continued whispering and gesturing toward Keanu. The elderly couple sitting with Keanu exchanged uncomfortable glances. The wife leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "I'm so sorry about them." Keanu smiled softly. "You don't need to be. I've met people like that my whole life. They just don't understand what peace looks like yet." Her husband chuckled under his breath. "You're handling it better than I would." Keanu's calm presence seemed to steady the small circle of people near him. His serenity created a quiet contrast to the noise around the room. When the waitress returned with another tray, he stood again to help her make space at the table. The young woman looked flustered by the attention and said, "You don't have to, sir." "I know," Keanu said gently, "but it's good to make someone's job a little easier." She smiled and walked away with a lighter step. At Ryan's table, Derek snickered. "Did you see that? The man's a saint. Maybe he'll wash the dishes next." Ryan leaned back with a smug grin. He's not fooling anyone. It's just another act. Some people pretend to be humble, so people will talk about it later. Their laughter once again filled the air. But this time, something shifted in the room. Several nearby guests gave them disapproving looks. Emily, the young journalist who had been walking around the ballroom with her notebook, stopped near their table, frowning slightly. She had been covering celebrity donations and photo ops for years, but what she saw now didn't fit the usual script. She turned to glance toward the back, spotting Keanu sitting quietly, now sharing a quiet laugh with the older couple. Her curiosity grew. She scribbled a few notes on the page, something about kindness being misunderstood. She didn't know why, but her instinct told her the story of the night wasn't happening at the front tables. It was unfolding quietly in the shadows, behind humility and patience. Ryan noticed her glance and smirked. "Even the reporters look bored," he whispered. "Maybe we should give them something worth writing about." Derek raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Ryan's grin widened. "Let's see if Mr. Modesty cracks." The storm was getting closer. Ryan's chair screeched against the polished floor as he stood, his glass raised high. "A toast!" he announced, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The MC paused mid-sentence on stage, unsure whether to intervene. Ryan's grin didn't waver. "A toast," he repeated, glancing toward Keanu, "to the heroes who show up with the biggest hearts and the smallest wallets." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most guests stayed silent, stunned by the audacity. Derek forced a laugh, sensing the awkwardness. "Come on, Ryan, sit down." But Ryan was enjoying himself too much. No, I mean it. Look at him, he's an inspiration. Comes here alone, no designer car, no PR team. Just a regular guy, trying to prove he's still relevant." He gestured toward Keanu's table, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. Hollywood royalty reduced to humility. The insult lingered like poison in the air. Emily's pen froze on her notepad. A few guests gasped softly. Even the band hesitated mid-song, the notes faltering before finding rhythm again. Keanu looked up from his seat, meeting Ryan's gaze for the first time that night. The room seemed to hold its breath. But instead of anger, there was only calm in his eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a child's tantrum. Then, he turned back to the elderly couple and resumed his quiet conversation. That silence struck harder than any words could have. Ryan's smirk faltered. The mockery that once felt powerful suddenly felt foolish in the face of such composure. The crowd began whispering again, this time not about Keanu, but about Ryan. Derek muttered under his breath, "You went too far, man." Ryan downed the rest of his drink, his pride unraveling. "He deserves it," he snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. The waitress passed again, carefully avoiding his table. She stopped briefly near Keanu's and whispered, "I don't know how you stay so calm." Keanu smiled gently. Because none of this really matters. The night's about the children, not me. His answer spread quietly among those who overheard it. Emily wrote it down word for word. At the front of the room, the MC regained control, thanking everyone for attending and reminding guests of the night's purpose: building futures for underprivileged youth. The words hung in sharp contrast to the arrogance that had just played out. Ryan slumped in his chair, glaring at his empty glass. Around him, the whispers grew louder, no longer about Keanu's modesty, but about Ryan's cruelty. The shift had begun, subtle but unstoppable. And somewhere deep inside that glittering ballroom, the line between pride and grace had already been drawn. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain, mixed with laughter that carried across the ballroom. The night had settled into its rhythm of self-congratulation. Conversations turned louder, more animated. As the guests grew comfortable in their luxury, the tables near the front became miniature stages where egos performed for applause. Among them, Ryan Huxley's table had become the loudest of all. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, the dim light glinting off his platinum watch. His voice boomed above the others, drawing the kind of attention he craved. "You know what I told my broker?" he said with a smirk. "If a car costs less than 200 grand, it's not worth driving." His friends burst into laughter. Derek, the young tech entrepreneur with slick charm and little restraint, lifted his glass and grinned. "That's because you've never had to fly commercial, man. Once you go private jet, there's no turning back." Ryan nodded, grinning wider. "Exactly. The world looks different when it bends to your schedule." Across the table, another guest chimed in, bragging about a yacht he had just bought in Miami. Every story grew bigger than the last, as though the night itself were a competition for who could sound the most powerful. Their watches gleamed under the chandeliers. Their suits were perfectly tailored, each brand name worth more than what most families earned in a year. The conversation, though shallow, carried the same rhythm as the jazz band, lively, repetitive, and entirely self-absorbed. At the edge of their table, Derek glanced toward the back of the room and spotted Keanu sitting quietly. His presence irritated him for reasons he couldn't explain. "Look at him," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Hollywood can't save you from going broke, huh?" Ryan followed his gaze, smirked, and nodded. "It's sad, really. Once the spotlight fades, they all try to reinvent themselves. Charity events, philosophy quotes, pretending not to care about fame. It's just another performance." Derek laughed. Maybe he's hoping someone notices his humility. Ryan chuckled and took another sip of his drink. "That's the oldest trick in the book. The whole 'I don't need money to be happy' line usually means they don't have money anymore." Their table erupted in laughter again, the sound sharp and ugly against the backdrop of polite conversation elsewhere. Meanwhile, Keanu remained still. He sat with a straight posture, his face calm, his eyes distant but present. The slideshow on the stage displayed pictures of children smiling in new classrooms, hospitals built in rural areas, and families holding up thank you banners. None of the men at Ryan's table noticed. Keanu watched quietly, his expression softening at the images. When the MC mentioned our anonymous donors who make all this possible, Ryan scoffed loudly. "Anonymous means broke," he said, his voice carrying further than he intended. A few guests looked his way, disapproving. Keanu leaned back in his chair and exhaled softly. He wasn't angry, just quietly disappointed. Ryan's laughter echoed off the marble walls, lingering in the air longer than anyone cared to hear. He didn't notice the stares from nearby tables, or maybe he didn't care. His confidence was the kind that fed on attention. "You know," he said, swirling his drink, "people love to talk about giving, but they never talk about what they get from it. Me, I like results. I like knowing my name's on the building I helped fund." Derek grinned. "Exactly. What's the point of charity if no one knows you did it? I mean, what's the return on that investment?" Another man across from them, a venture capitalist with a bright red tie, nodded enthusiastically. "It's all about visibility. Donations are great marketing, when you do it right. Their glasses clinked together in shallow celebration. The words philanthropy and brand expansion mixed together like oil and water. Their conversation, though polished, sounded hollow. It wasn't about helping anyone. It was about legacy, image, and leverage. As they laughed, Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the slideshow. The photos had shifted to show a rural community center, its walls freshly painted, children gathered outside with new backpacks. He smiled faintly. He knew that place. It was one of the first projects the foundation ever funded, years ago, when few believed it would last. At Ryan's table, the laughter grew louder. Anonymous donors, Ryan repeated mockingly. That's just a fancy word for people who want to feel noble without opening their wallets. He took another sip and looked around for agreement. His friends nodded automatically, their approval cheap and easy. Emily, the journalist, stood at the back of the room with her notepad. She had been watching both tables, the loud one drenched in ego, and the quiet one where humility sat, unbothered. She scribbled a few words down. The difference between those who give to be seen and those who give because they see. Something about that thought made her heart race. Keanu turned his head slightly and caught sight of Ryan's group. Their exaggerated laughter didn't anger him. If anything, it reminded him of the years when he too had confused worth with appearance. Fame had once been a mirror he didn't know how to escape. He had learned since then that light only reveals what pride tries to hide. At one point, Derek leaned toward Ryan. You think Reeves ever did anything real for charity? Ryan smirked. If he had, we'd have heard about it. These Hollywood types love press. It's how they stay alive. Derek nodded. True. No one's quiet out of goodness, they're quiet because they've got nothing to show. A ripple of agreement circled the table. Their voices grew louder again, competing not just for attention, but for dominance. The gala's purpose, the children, the cause, had vanished beneath the roar of ego. Meanwhile, Keanu folded his napkin neatly on the table, his thoughts distant. He wasn't thinking of the insults or the stares. He was thinking of the little boy from a small Arizona town who once wrote to the Horizon Foundation saying, "I want to be like the man who paid for my school." That memory alone was worth more than applause. The noise of vanity filled the hall, but the sound of quiet integrity had already begun to speak louder. The MC's voice echoed over the microphone again, trying to draw attention back to the stage. Tonight, we honor 10 years of community rebuilding, education, and hope, he said with enthusiasm. And while many donors prefer to remain anonymous, their impact speaks louder than their names ever could. His words floated into the air, perfectly timed to meet Ryan's sneer. Anonymous means broke, Ryan whispered again, almost as a reflex. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his cleverness. The laughter from his table had started to die down, but he kept pushing, desperate to keep the spotlight he'd built for himself. Let's be honest, he said, raising his glass. If you're really changing the world, you'd want credit for it. A few of the men around him nodded, but with less enthusiasm than before. Even they could sense how hollow it sounded against the MC's heartfelt tone. Keanu, still at his seat near the back, watched quietly. The slideshow showed children painting murals, volunteers building playgrounds, and teachers standing in classrooms funded by those silent gifts. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes soft but unreadable. There was pride in his heart, but not the kind that demanded attention. It was the quiet joy of knowing good things were happening, whether anyone ever thanked him or not. Ryan caught the direction of Keanu's gaze and scoffed. You see that? He muttered to Derek. He's staring at the screen like he built all that himself. Derek hesitated before laughing. The doubt in his expression didn't escape Emily, who stood nearby, observing every exchange. She could feel the tension in the air, the sharp divide between noise and grace. She wrote in her notebook again. The loudest tables don't always have the most to say. The MC's voice grew more emotional as he concluded the segment. To all who give, seen or unseen, we thank you. Your generosity continues to shape futures. The crowd applauded warmly, and for a brief moment, sincerity returned to the room. Keanu clapped quietly, his expression humble and reflective. Ryan only rolled his eyes. People love their speeches, he said, signaling for another drink. As the applause faded, the ballroom lights dimmed once more. The air shifted something subtle but real. The contrast between vanity and virtue had been drawn so clearly that everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't yet name it. And as the night pressed on, one truth became impossible to ignore. The louder the laughter grew at Ryan's table, the smaller it began to sound. Dinner was served beneath a shimmer of candlelight. Silver lids were lifted from plates, revealing elegant dishes that looked more like art than food. The music softened, allowing the murmur of voices to fill the space again. But at Ryan's table, the conversation didn't quiet. It grew louder, fueled by ego and expensive wine. Ryan tapped his fork against his glass, signaling for attention even though no one had asked for it. "You know," he said confidently, "public image is everything. You can do all the charity work in the world, but if no one sees it, it's wasted." Derek leaned back with a smirk. "Couldn't agree more. Humility's bad PR. Nobody remembers the quiet givers." Ryan laughed. "Exactly. You want people to know your name. That's what legacy is. When I make a donation, I make sure there's a plaque, a photo op, something that reminds everyone who made it happen." He raised his glass and added, "Visibility, gentlemen. That's real impact." The men around him nodded approvingly. To them, generosity wasn't about kindness. It was about branding. They spoke about charity the way others spoke about profit margins. Ryan recounted how he once refused to donate unless his company logo was displayed on a new hospital wing. "Why give money just to disappear?" he said proudly. "If you're invisible, you're irrelevant." At the far end of the ballroom, Keanu's quiet presence was the complete opposite. He listened without interrupting, not because he agreed, but because he had long ago learned the value of silence. His table remained a small island of calm amid the rising tide of arrogance. The elderly couple beside him chatted softly, grateful to be near someone who brought peace rather than noise. Emily, the young journalist, sat a few tables away, jotting notes as she observed the contrast. She'd been sent to cover the gala's atmosphere, to capture the sparkle and glamour for a lifestyle column. But what caught her attention wasn't the luxury or laughter. It was the man sitting alone, unnoticed, yet completely at ease. When the waiters began clearing the first course, she hesitated for a moment, then stood. Something about Keanu's stillness drew her in. She walked toward the back of the room, notebook in hand, weaving past the clusters of guests until she reached his table. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked softly. Keanu looked up, his expression kind but cautious. "Yes?" "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, smiling nervously. "I'm covering the event. You seem different from everyone else tonight." Keanu's eyes held warmth but also distance. "Different how?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "You're not trying to be noticed." He smiled faintly. "Attention fades. Good. Deeds don't." For a moment, Emily forgot the noise of the room entirely. There was something in his voice steady, sincere, almost timeless. She realized the real story of the night wasn't written in the glittering front tables. It was sitting quietly in the back, choosing not to be seen. Emily pulled out her small notepad, but she didn't write immediately. Instead, she studied Keanu for a moment. The glow of the chandelier above reflected in his calm eyes that seemed to have seen the world and quietly learned from it. Around them, laughter from Ryan's table rang out again, loud, hollow, and competitive. Emily glanced toward the noise, then back at Keanu. "You don't seem to care about any of that," she said softly. "The status, the show, the power plays." Keanu chuckled under his breath. "Maybe it's because I've seen how temporary it all is. Fame is like a shadow, it only exists when there's light. The moment the spotlight moves, it's gone." Emily smiled faintly. "That's beautifully said." Keanu looked down at the water glass in front of him, then added, "The strange thing is, the more people chase light, the more they forget why they wanted it in the first place. They stop seeing others standing in the dark." Emily felt a shiver of recognition at his words. As a journalist, she'd spent years writing stories about luxury, about fame, and faces that demanded attention. But she'd never written about someone who deliberately avoided it. She felt the weight of her pen in her hand and began to write, but her curiosity wasn't satisfied yet. "So, why are you here then?" she asked. "This doesn't seem like your kind of place." Keanu smiled. "It's not, but the cause is. The Horizon Foundation helps kids who don't get chances. I grew up knowing what it's like to need one." Emily's expression softened. "You're one of the sponsors?" He paused for a moment, considering the question. "Just someone who believes in what they do," he said finally. Emily wanted to press further, but there was something in his tone, a gentle boundary, not secrecy, but humility. She realized he wasn't hiding anything for pride's sake. He simply didn't want recognition. Meanwhile, Ryan's table burst into another wave of laughter. "You know what kills me?" Ryan said loudly enough for others to hear. "People who act humble at these things. It's like fake modesty. They want attention for not wanting attention." Derek smirked. "It's all performance. The world runs on image. Doesn't matter what you do. What matters is who sees it." Ryan nodded. "That's the truth. I donate just enough to make the headlines. That's how you stay relevant." Keanu heard their voices clearly, but he didn't turn around. Emily noticed his stillness and whispered, "They're talking about you." "I know," he said quietly. "But they're not really talking to me. They're talking to the mirror they live in." Emily's breath caught at the calm certainty of his words. For the first time all night, she saw how different he truly was, not because of his fame, but because of how little it meant to him. She closed her notebook slowly, realizing she had more than enough for her article. Yet, something told her this story wasn't meant to be written. It was meant to be remembered. Emily stayed at the table a little longer than she'd planned. The room was alive with noise, but the space around Keanu felt almost separate, an island of quiet clarity in the middle of vanity. She hesitated before asking her next question. "You don't mind people misunderstanding you, do you?" Keanu shook his head gently. "No. People see what they're ready to see. That's not something you can control. The only thing that matters is why you do something, not whether someone else approves of it." Emily wrote that down, word for word. It wasn't just an answer. It was a principle. "So you really believe good can exist without recognition?" she asked. He smiled. "If doing good needs applause, it's no longer good. It's just performance." Emily looked down, realizing how rare it was to hear words like that in a place built on attention. She followed his gaze toward the stage. The slideshow continued, showing photos of new schools, hospitals, and community centers. The MC praised the generosity of donors, but not once did Keanu's name appear on the screen. Ryan's voice cut through again, his laughter sharp as glass. "See that? Anonymous donors. Just people who want to feel important without paying much. Real givers make sure the world knows who they are." Keanu didn't flinch. He just smiled faintly, as if he'd heard the same tune many times before. "It's strange," he said to Emily quietly, "how people measure worth by how loud it sounds. But real kindness is like oxygen. You don't notice it, but you can't live without it." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "That's actually beautiful." "Maybe," Keanu said softly, "but it's simple truth. The world's full of noise. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay silent and keep doing what's right." The two of them sat quietly for a moment, listening to the room filled with laughter and pretense. The elderly couple beside Keanu smiled knowingly, as though they understood every word without needing to join in. At the front, the MC called for attention again, inviting guests to prepare for the awards segment. Applause erupted, chairs shuffled, and the evening rolled forward. But at the back of the room, something different was happening. A quiet understanding had formed between a humble man and a young reporter who finally saw what true generosity looked like. The ballroom lights began to dim slowly, casting a soft amber glow over the tables. The noise of clinking glasses and laughter faded into murmurs as the stage lights brightened. A hush spread through the crowd as the MC's voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the chairman of the Horizon Foundation, Mr. Alan Whitford." A wave of applause followed, though it wasn't the thunderous kind that came from admiration. It was polite, routine. Only a few stood to show respect. The rest clapped half-heartedly, already checking their phones or reaching for another drink. From the corner of the ballroom, Keanu straightened in his seat. A small smile touched his lips. He knew Alan Whitford well, a man whose sincerity had built the foundation into what it had become. Whitford had a reputation for being honest to a fault, someone who treated every donation, no matter the size, with equal gratitude. His silver hair gleamed under the spotlight as he slowly made his way to the podium. Ryan Huxley leaned toward Derek with a smirk. "Old man still loves giving away money," he whispered. "If I had half his fortune, I'd be investing, not handing it out to random causes." Derek chuckled. Maybe he just likes the applause. Their laughter was soft but sharp enough to earn a few disapproving looks. Emily, still standing near the back, frowned at them before returning her gaze to the stage. Whitford adjusted the microphone and gave a slow nod to the audience. His voice, though aged, carried the authority of a man who had earned every bit of respect he commanded. "Good evening, friends," he began. "It's a privilege to stand before you tonight, celebrating 10 years of the Horizon Foundation's work." He paused, scanning the crowd, his gaze steady and kind. "When we began, our goal was simple: to give every child, regardless of circumstance, a chance at a future. We've built schools, hospitals, and community centers not through the work of one man, but through the kindness of many." Polite applause followed, but it was clear not everyone was listening. At the front tables, conversations had already resumed in hushed tones about mergers, stock trends, and political gossip. Whitford's words floated over them like a soft wind that few cared to feel. Ryan poured himself another drink, whispering, "He says the same thing every year." Keanu heard the comment faintly, but ignored it. His eyes remained on the stage, quietly admiring the man who had dedicated his twilight years to something beyond profit. Whitford continued, "But tonight, I want to speak about something deeper than giving. I want to speak about intention, why we give, and what it truly means to serve." His voice grew softer, yet somehow stronger. The words began to draw the room back into silence. And as his speech deepened, even the most distracted guests began to feel a shift in the air, though few yet understood why. "Mr." Whitford placed his hands gently on the podium, leaning forward slightly as if speaking to old friends rather than a crowd of elites. His tone carried warmth, but there was gravity behind every word. "In all these years," he said slowly, "I've met two kinds of people: those who give to be remembered, and those who give so others can live." A ripple of quiet swept through the room. The statement struck differently than the polite lines that usually filled such speeches. Even the waiters paused momentarily, glancing toward the stage. "At this foundation," Whitford continued, "we've seen the power of silent generosity. Not the kind that demands attention, not the kind that's printed in headlines, but the kind that simply builds, brick by brick, future by future." Emily scribbled furiously in her notebook, her heart racing. She looked at Keanu, whose expression hadn't changed. He was still watching quietly, hands folded. She had a sudden realization that Whitford's words weren't abstract. They were leading somewhere. Ryan leaned toward Derek again, muttering, "He's setting up another recognition speech, probably for someone rich enough to deserve it." Derek smirked. "You mean us?" Ryan chuckled. "Wouldn't be surprised." Whitford took a sip of water, then smiled faintly. "Many of you here tonight have given with great generosity. Your contributions have changed lives, and for that, the Horizon Foundation thanks you deeply. But there's one person, one soul, whose quiet compassion has defined what this foundation truly stands for." Ryan grinned. "Here we go," he whispered. "Watch this. It's going to be one of the big names, probably me or someone from the sponsor list." Whitford's gaze swept across the crowd. The lights dimmed slightly behind him, the screen behind the podium fading to a soft image of children standing in front of a new school building. "This individual," Whitford said, his voice calm and reverent, "has funded over 30 programs across the country. Schools, hospitals, and community centers. all without once asking for recognition. The room grew still. Even the sound of forks and glasses ceased. Ryan straightened in his chair, feigning modesty. "That's a nice introduction," he whispered, adjusting his cufflinks. "But 30 programs? Maybe he's talking about the Whitmore family." Emily watched the scene unfold, her pen frozen in midair. She could feel the tension ripple through the crowd, the sudden realization that something important was about to be revealed. Whitford paused for a long moment, letting silence do the work of suspense. His eyes softened. "In my years as chairman," he said, "I've met few people as genuine, as selfless, and as consistent in their generosity. Tonight, it's time the world knows what this person has done, not for fame, not for prestige, but because he believes goodness should never require permission." Ryan smirked, glancing toward Derek again. "Sounds familiar," he whispered. "I told you, legacy's everything." Keanu sat motionless, his face calm, but his eyes thoughtful. He had no idea what was coming next, though part of him sensed where Whitford's words might lead. And as the chairman reached for the next page of his speech, the room held its collective breath. "Mr." Whitford's voice softened as he looked toward the back of the ballroom. "Tonight," he said, "we honor a man who has quietly changed more lives than any public figure in this room. He's attended these events year after year, always sitting in the back, never taking credit. But the truth is, for over a decade, he has been the heart of this foundation's mission." A murmur spread through the audience. Heads turned instinctively, eyes sweeping across the tables. Even the staff stopped mid-step. Ryan's grin widened as he leaned toward Derek. "He's talking about me," he whispered. "Has to be. The heart of the mission? That's the kind of thing you say to the biggest donor." He straightened in his chair, ready for the spotlight. "Finally," Whitford continued, his tone steady, his expression proud. "He has built schools where children had no classrooms, funded hospitals where families had no hope, and given scholarships to those who thought their dreams had ended. He asked for nothing, no plaque, no article, no applause, just results." The screen behind him began to shift, through photos, projects, communities, smiling faces. A few of the images made Keanu's eyes flicker with recognition. He leaned forward slightly. Those were the projects he had quietly helped fund over the years, the ones he thought no one but the foundation knew about. Ryan squinted at the screen, confused. "Wait, those aren't my projects," he muttered. "What is this?" Derek frowned. "You sure?" Before Ryan could answer, Whitford lifted his gaze once more and said clearly, "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing our largest and most consistent donor for the past 10 years, Mr. Keanu Reeves." The room fell silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if struck by realization, a wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Forks hit plates. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The businessmen at Ryan's table turned pale, their arrogance dissolving in an instant. Keanu blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected his name to ever leave Whitford's lips. For a moment, he considered standing, but instead he remained seated, shaking his head slightly. The applause began hesitantly, then grew stronger, rising into a standing ovation that filled the hall. Ryan sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. Emily's heart pounded as she scribbled her final note of the night. The man they mocked for being quiet turned out to be the one changing the world. And at that moment, Keanu bowed his head, humbled, as the spotlight found him for reasons he'd never sought. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. The chandeliers shimmered above frozen faces, the air thick with disbelief. Forks hovered midair, untouched meals cooling on porcelain plates. Cameras clicked softly from the back of the room, catching the moment when pride turned to shame. On stage, Mr. Whitford smiled gently, steadying his voice. "Please stand and recognize Mr. Keanu Reeves, our largest and most consistent donor for the past 10 years. The words echoed across the marble floor like a wave no one could outrun. Every head turned toward the back corner where Keanu sat, still and almost invisible among the glittering crowd. 1,000 eyes fell on him at once. Ryan Huxley froze, his glass trembling in his hand. "Wait, what?" he muttered. his voice dry. His face went pale, the grin from earlier gone, as if erased by the sound of his own arrogance. Derek looked just as stunned, his jaw half open. Whitford continued, his tone filled with pride. For a decade, Mr. Reeves has quietly funded projects across this country. Libraries for schools that had none, scholarships for students who never dreamed they'd go to college, and medical programs for families of the very staff serving us tonight. The silence broke into gasps and scattered applause. A waitress near the corner wiped her eyes with her sleeve. The custodian by the door bowed his head, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. Slowly, the sound of clapping grew, spreading through the hall like the tide returning to shore. Keanu looked up from his seat, humility etched across his face. He shook his head slightly, trying to signal the chairman to continue without him, but the spotlight had already found him. It illuminated his calm expression, no pride, no discomfort, only quiet acceptance. Ryan tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. "No way," he whispered to Derek. "This has to be some kind of PR stunt." Derek didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on Keanu, as if trying to reconcile the man they'd mocked with the man being honored. Whitford spoke again, his voice softening. He never asked for recognition, never wanted his name mentioned. Every check he sent came with a single note that said, "For the children, no credit needed." That kind of giving doesn't just change numbers on a spreadsheet, it changes lives. The applause grew stronger now. People began standing one by one, until nearly the entire room was on its feet. Even those who'd whispered cruel things earlier were clapping, their pride replaced with respect. Keanu stood slowly, bowing his head in acknowledgement. The lights bathed him in gold as the sound of applause swelled into something pure and sincere. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but it's not about me." The hall went silent again, waiting for what he would say next. Keanu's voice carried, gently across the room, firm yet soft, the kind that silenced noise without needing power. "Everything you see on that screen," he said, nodding toward the slideshow still showing images of smiling children and families, "was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be lived. The foundation gave me the chance to give others a start, the same chance someone once gave me." A few people in the crowd lowered their eyes. The truth of his humility felt heavier than any speech the evening had heard so far. He continued, his tone warm, grounded. "I didn't grow up with much. I know what it's like to look at a door and wonder if it will ever open for you. Sometimes, one small act, one person believing in you is all it takes to change everything. That's why I give. Not to be noticed, but because kindness gave me a future once, and I promised myself I'd pass it on." The room fell into a silence that wasn't empty, it was full, almost sacred. Even Ryan's usual smirk had vanished. He stared blankly ahead, his earlier words echoing back like ghosts. Anonymous means broke. They now felt like a confession instead of a joke. Emily, her notepad forgotten, watched Keanu with wide eyes. She could feel every word in her chest. This wasn't a speech crafted for headlines. It was truth. Whitford returned to the microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Reeves, you've done more for this foundation than we could ever put into words. You've helped thousands of children, and you never once asked for thanks." Keanu shook his head again. "I just believe if you're fortunate enough to help, you should. You don't need applause for that." He smiled faintly, glancing around the room. The applause should belong to the people who do the real work, the teachers, the doctors, the staff here tonight. At that, the spotlight moved subtly to the serving team standing near the edges of the room. Waiters, cooks, and custodians. Many of them, stunned, found themselves being applauded. For once, the cameras turned away from the rich and famous to capture faces of those who usually went unseen. The applause grew louder, deeper, no longer polite but heartfelt. Even the band stopped playing to join in, clapping in rhythm with the rest of the crowd. Ryan's shoulders sank. He felt smaller than he ever had before. Derek, equally humbled, whispered, "He's the real thing." He just watched Keanu, who now stood with his hands folded, the light around him almost too still, too real. For years, Ryan had believed power came from being recognized. But in that moment, he understood what true influence looked like. And it wasn't loud. It was quiet, invisible, and deeply human. The applause still hadn't faded. It rolled like thunder through the grand hall, washing away the arrogance that had filled it just hours earlier. And Keanu, ever composed, bowed his head once more, not in pride, but in gratitude. When the applause finally softened, the room felt completely different. The air that once carried arrogance now held something gentler respect. People who had come to flaunt their success now sat quietly, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. The masks of wealth had cracked, revealing something far more human beneath. Mr. Whitford stepped forward again, visibly emotional. Keanu, on behalf of the Horizon Foundation, and on behalf of every child and family your generosity has touched, we thank you. You've taught us that kindness doesn't need a spotlight, it creates its own light. Keanu smiled and gave a small nod. I don't deserve thanks, he said simply. The foundation does the work. I just give what I can. His words, though few, held a weight that lingered in the silence after he spoke. Near the back, the waitress who Keanu had helped earlier that night felt tears rising. She whispered to a colleague, my cousin's daughter, she's in one of those schools. She got her scholarship because of him. Her voice broke, and he never said a word. The older custodian standing beside her added quietly, my grandson too. He wouldn't be in college if it weren't for the foundation's programs. Across the ballroom, people were no longer whispering mockery. They were whispering gratitude. Stories began surfacing, each one revealing how Keanu's unseen kindness had rippled through lives they hadn't realized were connected to him. Ryan Huxley sat motionless, his face flushed with shame. His glass remained untouched, condensation running down its side. Derek leaned toward him and said quietly, we laughed at him, and he was the one keeping this place alive. Ryan didn't reply. He couldn't. His pride had nothing to stand on anymore. Every insult, every sneer now echoed like a confession of ignorance. Keanu looked toward their table for the briefest moment. He didn't scold or smirk. Instead, he offered a small, genuine smile, one that forgave without needing words. Whitford turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give one more round of applause for Mr. Keanu Reeves, a man whose humility teaches us what true wealth really means. This time, the applause wasn't thunderous, it was pure. People stood not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. And as Keanu took his seat again, the cameras continued to flash, not to capture a celebrity moment, but to capture something far rarer, a glimpse of grace. The applause did not stop. It rolled through the grand ballroom like a living thing, warm and unending. But while the wealthy guests clapped politely, the sound that stood out most came from the back of the room, the waiters, servers, and custodians. They were clapping the hardest, their faces glowing with something far deeper than admiration. It was gratitude. One elderly custodian, still in his work uniform, stood with trembling hands as he wiped tears from his eyes. His voice cracked as he whispered to no one in particular. That man helped my granddaughter go to college. She's the first in our family to ever make it past high school. He looked at Keanu as though seeing a miracle in human form. Beside him, a young woman working at the dessert table covered her mouth, tears streaming silently. She whispered, my brother's surgery. It was through the Horizon program. Her coworker reached out, squeezing her hand as both of them joined in the applause with renewed strength. From one side of the room to the other, the invisible lines that once divided the privileged and the working vanished. The staff clapped until their palms turned red. Because they were no longer serving the guests, they were honoring the man who had changed their lives without ever asking for thanks. Whitford stepped closer to the microphone again. His voice was low, but it carried clearly over the sound of the applause. Mr. Reeves has never once asked for recognition, he said. Not once. That's what makes generosity real. The applause swelled again, louder, purer. Even the ones who had mocked now found themselves clapping. Though their movements were slower, their heads lowered. The laughter from earlier in the night had been replaced by silence between each beat of the hands that struck together a rhythm of humility, returning to a place that had forgotten it. Ryan Huxley sat completely still, staring at the stage. His earlier smirk was gone, erased, as if it had never existed. The drink beside him had gone untouched, its ice long melted. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes, not Derek's, not the guests', and certainly not Keanu's. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, whispering, "We made fools of ourselves." Ryan swallowed hard. "No," he said, his voice rough. "We made fools of him." And he never even fought back. He stared down at his hands, guilt pressing into his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Emily, standing near the wall with her camera, began taking photos again. Not of Keanu, not of the stage, but of the faces in the crowd. The waiters with tears in their eyes, the custodian clutching his hat to his chest, the humbled businessmen sitting in silence. This was the real story. A reversal of pride and power, captured in the language of emotion. Emily lowered her camera for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotion in the room. What she was witnessing went beyond a charity event. It was transformation. The applause had softened now, replaced by murmurs of awe, quiet conversations between guests who had finally realized how small their wealth seemed beside real generosity. Near the dessert table, the young woman who had whispered earlier stepped forward hesitantly. Her eyes met Keanu's across the room. She didn't say a word, but her lips formed a silent, "Thank you." It was a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 speeches. Keanu noticed and nodded gently, a warm smile in his eyes that spoke louder than any acknowledgement could. At Ryan's table, the laughter that had once dominated the evening had vanished completely. The men who had spent hours boasting now avoided each other's gaze. Their expensive watches caught the chandelier's light, but they no longer seemed to shine. One of them, a real estate investor who had joined in mocking earlier, muttered under his breath, "I thought success was about being seen. Guess I've been chasing the wrong thing." Ryan heard him but didn't respond. His thoughts were buried deep, replaying the night like a movie he couldn't stop. Every cruel word he'd spoken came back to him, clearer now, uglier in the light of truth. He remembered the jokes, the smug laughter, the sneers, and he saw them now for what they were, insecurities dressed as confidence. Whitford remained on stage, allowing the crowd to settle before continuing. "The Horizon Foundation exists because of people who care more about others than themselves," he said. "But tonight we are reminded that the truest form of giving is the kind that expects nothing." Mr. Reeves never stood in the spotlight. Yet, through his silence, he illuminated countless lives. Emily scribbled those words in her notebook. Through his silence, he illuminated countless lives. She knew that line would stay with her long after the story was published. Ryan's throat tightened. The more he listened, the smaller he felt. For years, he had believed philanthropy was a performance. He'd built his public image on handshakes and photo ops, each donation tied to a headline. And now, watching Keanu bow his head humbly in a room full of people who finally understood him, Ryan felt something he hadn't in years: shame, followed closely by admiration. Derek leaned in quietly. "You think he planned all this?" Ryan shook his head. "No, that's the point. He didn't plan it. That's what makes it real." Keanu glanced briefly in their direction. His expression wasn't smug or triumphant. It was compassionate, as if he could sense their regret and chose forgiveness instead. That quiet mercy struck Ryan harder than any rebuke could have. The sound of chairs shifting filled the silence as people began rising to their feet again, not for formality, but because something inside them demanded to. Gratitude had replaced vanity, and for the first time that night, the applause felt clean. As the applause faded into a reverent hush, the atmosphere in the ballroom felt transformed. The arrogance that had once filled the air had dissolved into sincerity. The chandeliers glowed softly over tear-streaked faces, and for the first time that night, the room seemed united not by wealth, but by shared humility. Emily stepped closer to the stage to capture a final image. Through her lens, she didn't just see a famous actor standing in recognition. She saw something almost spiritual. Keanu stood with his hands loosely clasped, bowing his head slightly as though the moment didn't belong to him. Around him, people from every corner of the room, guests, staff, even the kitchen workers who had stepped out to see, looked at him with the same unspoken gratitude. Whitford turned toward the audience once more. "It's easy to measure success by what we accumulate," he said. "But the true measure of a person lies in what they quietly give away. Mr. Reeves has taught us that tonight." A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the guests. The words cut through the noise of ego like a cleansing wind. Even the reporters, who had come expecting a typical celebrity story, found themselves writing something different, something that felt important. Near the back, the elderly custodian wiped his eyes again. "That man doesn't even know me," he whispered, "but he changed my family forever." Keanu noticed him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. His eyes filled with gentle warmth. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't pride, it was recognition, from one human being to another. Ryan watched that exchange and exhaled slowly. He turned to Derek and said, "You know, for all the money I've made, I don't think I've ever given anything that actually mattered." His voice trembled slightly. "I've been chasing applause my whole life, and he's been giving quietly the whole time." Derek stared at the floor. Maybe we both needed this. The MC stepped back up to the microphone. His voice, softer now. "Let's take a moment of silence, not for loss, but for gratitude, for the unseen kindness that keeps this world moving forward." The entire room went quiet. No clinking glasses, no whispers. Just silence, deep, collective, and powerful. When it ended, people began to applaud again. This time, not for spectacle, but for understanding. And at the center of it all, Keanu bowed once more, the picture of humility that had quietly rewritten what the room believed greatness truly looked like. When the ceremony ended, the music returned softly, a slow jazz tune that filled the quiet corners of the ballroom. The guests began to rise from their tables, their conversations gentler now, as though the night itself had taught them to speak more softly. Waiters cleared plates while reporters packed away their cameras. The laughter that had once dominated the air was gone, replaced by something quieter reflection. Keanu stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. The lights of Los Angeles stretched endlessly beyond the glass, glowing like a map of a world he had learned to navigate differently from everyone else. He had no entourage waiting, no swarm of publicists or photographers, just calm. Across the room, Ryan Huxley watched him, his chest heavy with the weight of his earlier arrogance. His drink had long since gone untouched. Derek stood beside him, hands in his pockets, equally uneasy. The two men who had once commanded attention now felt like intruders in their own world. Ryan took a deep breath. "I need to talk to him," he said quietly. Derek hesitated. "You sure?" "After tonight." Ryan nodded. "Exactly because of tonight." He walked slowly across the marble floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. People moved aside for him, though not out of respect, out of curiosity. They could tell he wasn't walking with the swagger he'd shown earlier. He was walking with humility. Keanu noticed him approaching and turned, his expression kind, unreadable. "Ryan," he said calmly, as though greeting an old acquaintance rather than someone who had mocked him hours earlier. Ryan's throat tightened. For the first time in years, he didn't have the right words. He stopped, exhaled, then started again. "I owe you an apology." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "For what?" Ryan's voice wavered. "For everything I said tonight. For judging you. For laughing at you. For assuming that quiet meant weak." "I didn't know." Keanu smiled gently, the same calm presence that had carried him through the entire evening. "You didn't have to know," he said. "The point isn't who gives, it's that giving happens." Ryan looked down, embarrassed by how simple and sincere the answer was. He had expected judgment, but instead he was met with grace. Emily stood a few feet away, pretending to check her notes, though her heart was still caught in the conversation unfolding before her. She had spent years covering men like Ryan, men who demanded to be seen. But she had never witnessed anyone like Keanu, someone who commanded respect through silence rather than power. Derek approached, his voice softer than usual. "You taught me something tonight," he said quietly. "Actually, more than I ever learned in business school." Keanu looked at him with that same easy warmth. "We're all learning," he replied. "Every day." Derek chuckled nervously. "Some of us are a little late to class." Keanu laughed gently, not at them, but with them. "That's all right," he said. "What matters is that you showed up." Ryan managed a faint smile, one that carried gratitude instead of ego. "You're not like anyone I've met, Keanu." "Maybe that's because I'm not trying to be," Keanu said, his voice calm. "I just try to remember that what we give says more about us than what we keep." The words hung between them like truth made visible. Ryan nodded slowly, humbled in a way that couldn't be faked. The conversation lingered in a comfortable silence. Around them, guests began to leave in small groups, their expensive shoes clicking lightly against the floor. The air smelled faintly of perfume and fading champagne, yet something about the night now felt pure, as if it had shed its pretense. Emily closed her notebook completely. She didn't want to write anymore. She just wanted to remember the way this moment felt, the stillness, the honesty. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his voice quieter now. "You know," he said slowly, "I've built a life out of trying to be seen. My company, my investments, my image, every part of it was about making sure people remembered my name. But tonight, you showed me that the things that matter most happen when no one's watching." Keanu smiled faintly. "You'll be surprised how much lighter life feels when you stop trying to be noticed." Ryan looked away for a second, his jaw tightening. "It's humbling. I spent years believing wealth made me powerful. But standing here right now, I realize how small I've been." He met Keanu's eyes again. "You've done more by being quiet than most of us do with all our noise." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about quiet or loud. It's about intent. Some people speak loudly because the world needs to hear their truth. Others work quietly because the world needs their results. Both matter." Derek crossed his arms, thoughtful. "But how do you stay grounded in a world like this? Everyone's chasing validation, success, fame. Doesn't it ever get to you?" Keanu chuckled softly. "It used to. I chased it once too, until I realized that validation doesn't fill you, it drains you. Every time you live for someone else's approval, you give away a piece of yourself. I just decided to stop giving mine away." Ryan nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with understanding. "I think I've spent half my life giving pieces of myself to the wrong things." Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then, start giving to the right ones." Emily felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a lesson. She could see the change happening in real time. The kind of moment that doesn't make headlines but makes people better. Ryan exhaled and gave a small, sincere smile. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for what you've done, but for what you didn't say when you could have humiliated me. You could have made me look small tonight. You didn't." Keanu's eyes softened. Humiliating someone doesn't teach them anything, but kindness does. Derek let out a quiet laugh. "You really are one of a kind, Keanu. Most people would have rubbed it in." Keanu smiled again. "Maybe I just know what it feels like to be lost. Everyone deserves a chance to find their way back." The three of them stood there for a while longer, saying nothing, letting the hum of soft music and quiet conversations fill the space around them. Ryan finally extended his hand. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm going to start doing better with my money, my time, and my words." Keanu shook his hand firmly. Then tonight wasn't wasted. As Ryan and Derek walked away, Emily stayed behind for a moment. "You really mean everything you say, don't you?" she asked. Keanu smiled gently. "If you don't, then what's the point of saying it?" She nodded, moved. "The world needs more people like you." Keanu looked out the window again, where the city lights flickered faintly in the distance. "The world just needs more people who care." he said softly. That's enough. The rain had started just as the night began to wind down. Soft droplets tapped against the glass windows of the Horizon Hotel, smearing the reflections of city lights across the marble floor inside. Guests hurried into waiting cars, shielding their hair and designer clothes beneath umbrellas held by assistants. The glamour of the evening was fading fast, leaving behind only the quiet echo of music and the scent of rain on the pavement. Keanu stepped outside alone. He didn't rush, didn't flinch at the drizzle that clung to his jacket. The flashes of cameras sparked immediately, reporters shouting his name, hoping for a quote about his unexpected recognition. But he lifted a hand politely, his smile calm. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but clear. "No interviews tonight." He turned to leave, moving toward the valet stand where the night staff were still working under a thin canopy. One of the valets, a young man no older than 20, accidentally dropped a stack of parking tickets onto the wet ground as he hurried to bring a car forward. The papers scattered in the rain. Without hesitation, Keanu bent down beside him, helping to pick them up one by one. "It's okay, sir," the valet stammered, embarrassed. "I've got it." Keanu smiled. "I've got it too." He gathered the last few tickets, straightened up, and handed them back. The young man nodded gratefully, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." As Keanu walked toward his old Ford truck parked a few spots away, the reporters who had been waiting for a dramatic quote finally lowered their cameras. There was no drama, no spectacle, only quiet decency that spoke louder than headlines ever could. From the doorway of the hotel, Ryan Huxley watched the entire scene unfold. His coat was draped over his arm, his tie loosened, his eyes distant. Derek stood beside him, silent. They didn't say anything at first, just watched as the man they had mocked spent his last moments at the Gala helping a valet in the rain. Finally, Ryan exhaled and said softly, "That man's richer than all of us." Derek nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "And the crazy thing is, he doesn't even know it." Ryan gave a faint smile that carried both sadness and admiration. "No," he said. "He knows. He just doesn't measure it the same way we do." As Keanu climbed into his truck, the headlights illuminated the puddles on the street. He gave one last wave to the staff still working outside before driving off into the rain, his old truck disappearing among the luxury cars like a whisper swallowed by thunder. Ryan stood there for a long time, letting the rain soak into his shoes, before finally turning back inside. Inside, the ballroom was nearly empty. The candles had burned down to their last flickers, and the once proud banners that had adorned the stage now hung quietly, their purpose fulfilled. Emily sat alone at a small table near the back, her laptop open and glowing softly against the dimmed lights. The keys clicked in steady rhythm as she began to type the story she knew she had been sent here to write, not the one about celebrity appearances or luxury auctions, but the one about what true greatness looks like when no one's watching. Her title appeared across the top of the page, almost instinctively. "The Man Who Gave Without Wanting Credit." She paused for a moment, thinking of the way Keanu had smiled when he said that kindness doesn't need applause. His words still echoed in her head as she began her opening paragraph. She described the gala not as a showcase of power, but as a mirror one that revealed who people truly were when their names weren't being announced. Sentence after sentence, her story took form. She wrote about how the man everyone underestimated had turned out to be the one carrying the entire foundation. She described the shift in the room when his name was spoken, the faces that softened, the arrogance that melted. And most of all, she captured the look on Keanu's face when he said, "It's not about me." When she finished the final line, Emily sat back and read it again. It wasn't just a report, it was a reflection of everything she had witnessed that night. She hit send, attaching the file to an email addressed to her editor with a simple note, "This one's different." Hours later, in a newsroom across the city, her editor opened the file. By morning, the headline was live. Within hours, the article spread like wildfire, shared on social media, reposted by major outlets, translated into different languages. Readers called it an incredible story. Thousands of comments poured in from people around the world, some inspired to donate anonymously. Others simply moved by the reminder that humility still existed in a world obsessed with recognition. The story reached far beyond Los Angeles. Teachers read it to their students. Small-town papers reprinted it in local columns. Even people who had never seen one of Keanu's films found themselves touched by the story of a man who gave quietly and walked away without a camera following him. Back at the Horizon Hotel, the staff who had worked that night found the article too. The young valet printed it out and taped it near the employee lounge, his eyes bright with pride. "He remembered me," he whispered to another worker. The elderly custodian brought a copy home to show his granddaughter, the one whose scholarship had been funded by Keanu's donations. "This," he said, holding it up with trembling hands, "is what true wealth looks like." Ryan saw the article the next morning as well. He read it twice, every word sinking deeper than the last. The photos of Keanu helping the valet, the humble expression on his face, the comments about his anonymous giving it all hit him harder than he expected. When he finally reached the last line, he closed his phone and looked out the window of his office. For the first time in years, the city lights didn't look like opportunity. They looked like responsibility. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "All right then, time to start doing better." And somewhere across town, Keanu Reeves sat quietly at a small diner, sipping his coffee as the rain eased outside. He didn't know about the article yet. He didn't know how far his story had spread or how many hearts it had touched. All he knew was that the world outside still needed more kindness and that his work, like the rain, wasn't finished yet. The morning sun rose over Los Angeles, cutting through the haze and glinting off the glass towers that filled the skyline. The city was waking up to a story that had already begun circling the globe. On every newsstand, on every phone screen, one headline dominated them all. Keanu Reeves, revealed as secret donor behind youth programs. Photos from the Horizon Gala flooded social media the moment Keanu stood humbly under the golden lights. The image of him helping the valet in the rain, and the quiet smile that had melted a room full of pride. Every outlet wanted a piece of the story. Talk shows debated the meaning behind his words. One anchor read his quote slowly, letting each word sink in. "If doing good needs to be seen, it is no longer good." The line spread faster than wildfire, reposted thousands of times by people inspired by the simple truth in it. News segments ran footage of the foundation's projects, children playing in newly built classrooms, teachers speaking about the scholarships that had changed their students' lives, and hospital staff thanking anonymous donors who had once been just a name on a check. Now the world knew who that name belonged to, but the man himself stayed silent. While television studios buzzed and social media erupted with praise, Keanu spent the morning in his usual way away from the spotlight. He stopped by a small coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard, ordering his drink quietly and chatting briefly with a barista who recognized him. She congratulated him shyly on the story, but he only smiled. "The story doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to the kids who made it possible." Meanwhile, across town, Ryan Huxley sat in a studio under bright lights, his suit pressed, his demeanor entirely different from the man who had once bragged about wealth. He had been invited for a live interview after publicly requesting a chance to speak. The host introduced him as the businessman who was at the Horizon Gala the night Keanu Reeves changed everything. Ryan adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "I was one of the people who got it wrong that night. I laughed at a man who turned out to be everything I'm not, but everything I want to be." The studio fell silent. The interviewer leaned forward. "And what did you learn?" Ryan took a deep breath. "That real success isn't about being known. It's about what you do when no one's looking. I used to think generosity meant writing a big check and making sure people saw my name on it. Keanu showed me that true generosity has no audience. Across the country, millions of viewers listened. Some were moved to tears, others quietly reflected on their own lives. By the time the segment ended, donations to the Horizon Foundation had already begun to skyrocket. By the afternoon, the foundation's phones wouldn't stop ringing. People from across the country were calling to ask how they could help. Donations came pouring in, small ones from teachers, students, and retired workers, and large ones from corporations that had suddenly discovered the power of quiet giving. The foundation's website nearly crashed from the surge of visitors. Mr. Whitford, sitting in his small office, could hardly believe what was happening. He looked over the growing list of donors and whispered to his assistant, "All this because one man decided to stay humble." He smiled, eyes bright with pride. He's changed the way people think about giving. Meanwhile, Emily's article was now everywhere. Major outlets reprinted it, and talk shows quoted her lines on air. She received hundreds of messages from readers thanking her for writing it, but she knew the real credit didn't belong to her. It belonged to the man who wanted no credit at all. She called Keanu later that day, her voice soft with emotion. "It's gone viral," she said. "People all over the world are talking about what you did." Keanu's reply was simple. "Then let's make sure they're talking about the right thing." "What do you mean?" she asked. He smiled on the other end of the line. "Let the story belong to the kids. They're the real stars here." Emily felt her throat tighten. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Of course," Keanu said. "It's their futures that matter."
"I just gave them a small push."
That night, while television hosts praised his generosity and hashtags filled social media, Keanu drove out of the city quietly, his old truck rumbling beneath the stars. He stopped by one of the schools the foundation had built years earlier. It was late, the campus empty, except for a few lights in the hallway. Through the windows, he could see a mural, painted by the students, a colorful wall that read, "Be the reason someone believes in good." He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, the mural's colors reflecting faintly in his eyes. That was the reason he gave. Not for applause, not for recognition, but because belief was something too valuable to let fade. Back in Los Angeles, Ryan appeared on one more broadcast that evening. This time, he wasn't selling an image or promoting a brand. He sat in a smaller studio, no spotlight, no prepared speech. "I reached out to the Horizon Foundation today," he said. "I made a donation, but not under my name, just anonymous." The host smiled. "Following in Keanu's footsteps?" Ryan shook his head. "No, just trying to walk in the same direction." By the end of the week, more than $2 million had been raised for the foundation. The story that began with laughter ended in unity. Keanu never spoke publicly about it again. He simply continued his quiet routines, riding his motorcycle through the hills, signing autographs for kids outside theaters, and sending his usual monthly check to the foundation. And though the world never stopped talking about his humility, Keanu Reeves remained exactly who he'd been before that night. The man who believed that the truest kind of wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give away unseen. Weeks passed, and the echo of that unforgettable night still rippled quietly through Los Angeles. The story of Keanu Reeves's anonymous giving had faded from the headlines, but not from the hearts of the people who had witnessed it. The Horizon Foundation was busier than ever, organizing volunteer drives, scholarship programs, and community outreach events. And this time, something was different. People who had once come to be seen were now showing up simply to serve. At a local community center on the edge of the city, volunteers gathered one Saturday morning to hand out warm meals to families in need. Among them were faces no one expected to see: Ryan Huxley, Derek, and several of the young businessmen who had once mocked Keanu at the Gala. Gone were their tuxedos and polished shoes. They wore simple shirts, jeans, and name tags that read, "Volunteer." The smell of soup and bread filled the air as they worked side by side with other helpers, packing boxes, handing out food, and greeting people with smiles. For the first time, they were part of something that didn't revolve around themselves. Ryan crouched beside a small boy with dark hair and bright eyes, handing him a bag filled with food and school supplies. "What's your name, buddy?" he asked gently. "Lucas," the boy said shyly. Ryan smiled. "Nice to meet you, Lucas. You excited about school?" The boy nodded. "I love it. I got a scholarship. My teacher said It was from the Horizon Foundation. Ryan froze. The words hit him like a wave. You got one of the scholarships? Lucas nodded proudly. Yeah. My mom says there's a man who helped kids like me. She says he's a movie star, but he doesn't tell anyone. Ryan's eyes burned as he swallowed hard. Do you know his name? The boy shook his head. Mom said it doesn't matter what his name is. It matters that he cared. Ryan turned away for a moment, blinking back tears. He had spent his whole life chasing legacy. And here was a child reminding him what true legacy really meant. He crouched lower, meeting Lucas's eyes. You keep studying, okay? And when you grow up, help someone else. Promise? Lucas grinned. I promise! Ryan stood up slowly, the tears finally spilling down his face. He looked at Derek, who had been watching the exchange from a few feet away. Derek gave a small, wordless nod, his expression soft. Now I get it, Ryan said quietly. His voice cracked as he looked at the line of families waiting for food, the volunteers working beside him, and the quiet joy in their faces. Now I understand what he was trying to show us. The event stretched into the afternoon, and though the volunteers were tired, there was a new kind of energy that no one wanted to let go of. For the first time, Ryan and the others weren't chasing numbers or recognition, they were chasing meaning. They worked quietly, serving meals, carrying boxes, and talking with families. Each smile they received felt like a kind of wealth they had never known. When the last of the meals had been handed out, Ryan sat on the curb outside the center, his shirt stained and his hands still smelling of bread and soup. Derek joined him, 2 bottles of water in hand. They drank in silence for a while, watching the families head home with food and gratitude in their eyes. Derek finally broke the silence. Feels different, doesn't it? Ryan nodded slowly. Yeah, I've made millions of dollars, but I've never felt this rich. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I used to think happiness was when people looked up to me. Now I think it's when I look up to someone like him. Derek smiled faintly. He's changed us more than we realized. Later that week, Ryan stopped by the Horizon Foundation's headquarters to deliver a donation not under his company's name, but personally and anonymously. He didn't ask for a plaque or a photo. He simply wanted to help. As he was leaving, he ran into Mr. Whitford in the lobby. Ryan, Whitford said warmly, shaking his hand. It's good to see you again. You've been keeping busy, I hear. Ryan smiled. Trying to, sir. Not the same way as before, though. Whitford chuckled softly. I've heard that too. You've become quite the regular at our events. Ryan shrugged, embarrassed. Just doing what I should have done all along. Whitford looked at him thoughtfully. You know, I've seen a lot of donors come and go. But what happened at that gala, what Keanu did, it didn't just raise money. It raised hearts. People like you and Derek, you're proof of that. Ryan nodded humbly. He changed everything for me, Mr. Whitford. I owe him more than I can say. That evening, Whitford drove to a quiet street lined with oak trees and found Keanu sitting on the front porch of a modest home, sipping tea. The house was small, warm, and full of the kind of peace that can't be bought. Whitford stepped out of his car with a smile. You're not easy to find, you know. Keanu laughed softly. That's the idea. The older man sat beside him. I wanted to thank you, he said, not just for what you've given to the foundation, but for what you've given to people. You didn't just change lives, you changed hearts. Keanu's expression softened. I didn't do much. They just needed a reminder. Sometimes you can't teach humility, you just live it. Whitford nodded, his eyes glistening. And you live it better than anyone I know. They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Inside the house, the television hummed softly. A news report played a segment about the new surge in anonymous donations across the country. People from every background were contributing to schools, hospitals, and shelters without names, without credit. Whitford smiled as he glanced through the window. You started something, Keanu. Keanu shook his head gently. No, I just reminded people that goodness doesn't need an audience. As dusk settled, The two men sat quietly, watching the sunlight fade. The city's noise seemed far away, replaced by the simple rhythm of a world that was, somehow, a little kinder than it had been before. It was late on a quiet Thursday evening when Emily returned to her apartment after another long day at the newsroom. The story she had written about Keanu Reeves still lingered in the public consciousness, though the frenzy had settled into something more meaningful. People weren't just sharing his quotes anymore, they were living them. Donations to charities had spiked across the country, many signed simply as anonymous. She dropped her bag onto the couch and noticed an envelope sitting on her small writing desk. It was cream-colored, simple, and addressed in careful handwriting. The return address wasn't printed, but she recognized the penmanship instantly. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Keanu's. She sat down and gently opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No letterhead, no signature, just his words written in dark blue ink. It read, "Never let kindness become performance. When compassion is quiet, it echoes the loudest." Emily read the words twice, her eyes stinging as she held the letter closer. The simplicity of it struck her harder than any headline she had ever written. It wasn't a message for the world. It was a reminder for her, a quiet truth from a man who understood what most people forgot. She placed the note back into the envelope, then carefully slid it into a small glass frame she had kept for years. It took its place on her desk beside her favorite photo of her late father, who had always told her that the most important stories weren't about fame, they were about people who gave without asking for anything back. The next morning, she brought the framed note to her office. Her editor noticed it instantly. "That from him?" he asked. Emily nodded softly. "Yes, and I think it says everything that needed to be said." He smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know, I've edited thousands of stories in this business, but this one might have actually changed people." Across town, the Horizon Foundation announced a new educational program to expand their scholarship reach. The board wanted to name it after Keanu Reeves to honor his decade of generosity, but when they reached out to him for approval, his response came swiftly through Mr. Whitford. "Call it For the Future. That's enough." When asked if he wanted his name included in the program's title, Keanu simply replied, "If it carries my name, people will focus on me." Keanu simply replied, "My name, my name, my name, and R. It's my, me. But if it carries hope, they'll focus on the kids." Whitford smiled when he read the message aloud to the board. It was classic Keanu, always redirecting praise, always pointing the spotlight elsewhere. The motion passed unanimously. The new program was officially titled For the Future, but the story didn't end there. When the announcement of the new program went public, it sparked another wave of inspiration, but this time, it wasn't about fame or recognition. The simplicity of the title, For the Future, moved people deeply. It carried no name, no brand, and no celebrity label, just purpose. Schools began reaching out, asking how they could participate. Local businesses offered funding. Parents wrote letters of gratitude. Among those watching the news was Ryan Huxley. He sat in his office, the same one that had once been lined with expensive art and symbols of status, but something had changed. The shelves that used to display trophies and framed magazine covers now held photos from volunteer events, letters from children, his donations had helped, and a single piece of paper pinned on his wall with Keanu's quote, "If doing good needs to be seen, it is no longer good." When he saw the name of the new program, he smiled faintly. For the Future. It was exactly what Keanu would have chosen. Without hesitation, Ryan picked up the phone and called the Horizon Foundation. "I'd like to make a contribution to the new scholarship program," he said. The woman on the line thanked him warmly and asked if he wanted his name listed as a sponsor. Ryan paused, glancing at the quote on his wall. "No," he said. "Anonymous is fine." After the call ended, he leaned back in his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. There was something freeing about giving without needing applause. For the first time, he understood what Keanu had meant about generosity being its own reward. Later that evening, Mr. Whitford called Keanu. "You won't believe this," he said, his voice glowing with satisfaction. "We just received a matching donation for the Future program, anonymous of course, but I'd bet my last dollar it's Ryan." Keanu laughed softly. "Then I guess the future's already looking brighter." Whitford smiled on the other end of the line. "You know, you've done something rare. You didn't just inspire, giving you inspired humility." Keanu's tone was calm, thoughtful. "I didn't do it. They just needed to see that kindness doesn't need an audience. When you live it, others follow." Meanwhile, Emily visited the Horizon Foundation headquarters a few days later to cover the story of the new program. As she walked through the halls, she noticed volunteers working with new families, students filling out scholarship forms, and photos of children from across the country displayed proudly on the walls. At the end of the corridor, a plaque caught her eye. It was beautifully carved, placed above the door to a new learning center. It read simply, "For the future, inspired by quiet generosity." She smiled, knowing exactly whose spirit lived behind those words. That night, Emily returned home and sat at her desk, her framed letter from Keanu glowing softly under the lamplight. She traced her fingers over the handwriting and whispered the words to herself, "Never let kindness become performance." When compassion is quiet, it echoes the loudest. Outside her window, the city lights shimmered, and she thought about how far one act of humility had reached. It had started in a ballroom full of arrogance and ended in classrooms full of hope. Somewhere out there, Keanu was probably helping someone else, quietly, without cameras, without witnesses. And Emily realized that maybe that was how the best stories in life were written, not in headlines, but in hearts changed by unseen hands. Months later, spring returned to Los Angeles, painting the city in soft gold and green. The air carried the scent of blooming jacaranda trees, their petals drifting down over the courtyard of a modest community college where a graduation ceremony was taking place. The Horizon Foundation had helped fund the education of many of the students there through its For the Future program, and the joy in the air felt genuine, earned, and alive. Keanu sat quietly near the back, dressed simply in a black jacket and jeans. No one recognized him at first. He wasn't there for attention. He was there to watch the next chapter of kindness unfold. On stage, a young woman named Sophia stepped up to the microphone, her cap slightly tilted, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. She took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Sofia Alvarez," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "And today, I graduate not just for myself, but for everyone who once told me I could." The crowd clapped warmly, but she lifted a hand for quiet, her next words trembling with sincerity. "There was a time when I thought I'd never make it here. My mom worked 2 jobs, and there were nights we couldn't afford dinner, let alone tuition. But then, something happened. Someone I never met believed in me, when no one else did." Keanu's head lifted slightly. He knew those words well. Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering as she looked over the audience. "That someone funded my scholarship. I don't know his name, but because of him, I get to stand here today. I get to tell every kid who thinks they're invisible that they're not." The audience broke into applause. Sophia stepped back, pressing a hand to her heart. Her mother, sitting in the front row, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. In the back row, Keanu's chest tightened. He didn't move or draw attention, but a quiet pride welled in him, not for himself, but for what Sophia represented. This was what all the giving had been for. Not fame, not praise, just this moment a life changed. After the ceremony, as students hugged their families and posed for pictures, Sophia walked through the crowd, clutching her diploma. She glanced toward the back and froze. There, half hidden near the door, stood Keanu Reeves, her breath caught. For a moment, she didn't believe it was real. But when he smiled softly and gave a small nod, tears streamed down her face. She ran to him without hesitation and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for my chance." Keanu hugged her gently, his tone calm and kind. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just promise to pass it on." Sophia nodded against his shoulder, sobbing quietly. "I will, I promise." As the sun began to sink behind the college courtyard, the sky turned a soft pink that reflected off the windows and shimmered on the rows of folding chairs. Sophia stood beside Keanu for a few moments longer, still overwhelmed, still clutching her diploma like a lifeline. Students were taking photos, families laughing, and the sound of new beginnings filled the air. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done something incredible," he said gently. "You finished the race. Now you get to help someone else start theirs." Sophia nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will," she said. "You changed everything for me. I want to do that for someone too," he smiled. "Then that's how this continues, one act at a time." Her mother came forward then, nervous but grateful, holding out her hand. "Mr. Reeves, I don't even know how to thank you," she said softly. "We prayed every night for a miracle, and then the scholarship came. We didn't know who it was from." Keanu shook her hand warmly. "It wasn't a miracle," he said. "It was a chance, and you two made the most of it." He congratulated them once more and slipped quietly away before anyone else could notice who he was. Sophia turned to look for him a minute later, but he was gone. All that remained was the echo of his words. Later that week, Keanu returned to the Horizon Foundation's community kitchen, where volunteers gathered every Friday to serve dinner to families in need. The room smelled of chili, cornbread, and hope. To his surprise, Ryan and Derek were already there, wearing aprons and handing out plates. Ryan grinned when he saw Keanu walk in. "Hey, look who's finally back," he said. "You took long enough." Keanu laughed. "I didn't realize I was late." Derek handed him a ladle. "You're right on time, actually." They worked side by side for hours, serving food and talking with families. There were no cameras, no reporters, no stage lights, just people helping people. Every smile, every thank you, every handshake carried a weight that no award or headline could match. At one point, Ryan paused to watch a young boy laugh as he shared a meal with his mother. He turned to Keanu and said quietly, "You know, I used to measure success by how much I had. Now I think it's how much I can give." Keanu smiled. "That's the best kind of wealth." Ryan nodded. "I learned that from you." Keanu shook his head. "You didn't learn it from me. You just remembered what it means to be human." Derek chuckled. "Well, maybe we all needed a reminder." The three of them continued to work into the evening, their laughter mingling with the chatter of families and children. Outside, the neon lights of the city glowed, but inside, a quieter kind of light filled the room, one that came from kindness itself. Over time, stories of that one night at the gala continued to spread across the city. People spoke of it not as gossip, but as a legend. A reminder that humility can move mountains, that compassion can change entire communities. And somewhere in that legend, Keanu Reeves remained what he had always been, not a star trying to shine brighter, but a man content to light the way for others. Months later, the Horizon Foundation gathered in the same grand ballroom where everything had begun. But the atmosphere was nothing like that glittering night of pride and vanity. The chandeliers still sparkled, the tables were still dressed in fine linen, but the tone had changed completely. The laughter was softer, the smiles more genuine. The people who once came to be seen now came to serve. It was the evening of a special announcement. Alan Whitford, the chairman who had led the foundation for decades, was officially retiring. As he walked to the podium, the crowd rose to their feet, honoring a man whose integrity had become the foundation's backbone. His hair was whiter now, his steps slower, but his voice carried the same strength it always had. "My friends," he began, looking over the room with affection. "When I started this foundation, I dreamed of helping others, but what I didn't realize was how much others would end up helping me. I've learned more about humanity in this hall than in all my years in business." He paused, smiling faintly as he looked toward a familiar face sitting near the back. "And one man, in particular, reminded me that giving is not an act, it's a way of being. Every head turned toward Keanu Reeves. He was dressed simply, as always, sitting quietly beside Mr. Prater, Whitford's family. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he smiled politely as the applause began. Whitford raised his hand for silence. Tonight, I step down as chairman of the Horizon Foundation. But before I do, I want to name someone who has been the heart of our mission, even when no one knew it. I want to name Keanu Reeves as the honorary patron of the foundation. The room erupted in applause. Keanu's head shook immediately, a quiet laugh escaping him. When Whitford gestured for him to come forward, he stood reluctantly, walking up to the stage with humility that made the moment even more powerful. He took the microphone, waited for the applause to fade, and said softly, "Thank you, Mr. Whitford. But I'm not comfortable being honored for something that was never meant to draw attention." The crowd fell quiet. Keanu continued, "If there's a title that needs to be given, let it belong to those who work here every day. The teachers, the volunteers, the families who fight for their children's futures. They're the real heroes. All I've done is help a little." Whitford smiled knowingly. "And that's exactly why you deserve it." Keanu shook his head gently. "Then do something for me instead. Take whatever you'd spend on a ceremony, on a plaque, on speeches, and turn it into more scholarships, more chances for kids like Sophia. That's the only recognition I'll accept." The audience applauded again, not because of the speech, but because of the sincerity that filled every word. It wasn't performance. It was truth. After the applause faded, Whitford nodded with deep respect. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," he said warmly. "Your humility will help more children than any title ever could." In the weeks that followed, the Horizon Foundation doubled its outreach. Inspired by Keanu's request, the board redirected all event funds into new educational programs. Dozens of scholarships were added to the For the Future initiative. Hospitals in small towns received new medical grants. Libraries were built in communities that had never had one. Each project carried the same simple plaque at its entrance, funded by quiet hearts. Keanu stayed involved, but quietly. He attended site visits and helped design new mentorship programs. When the foundation offered to name one of the libraries after him, he declined again. "No names," he said with a smile. "If people need to know who helped, tell them it was kindness." Mr. Whitford officially retired that spring, on Place Down. His last day, he stopped by Keanu's modest home, the same porch where they had spoken months before. He handed Keanu a small wooden box. Inside were photos of every school, clinic, and scholarship that the foundation had built with his help. Whitford's voice trembled slightly. "You showed us what giving truly means," he said. "You didn't just help people, you changed the way we think about what it means to give." Keanu looked through the photos quietly, his eyes soft. "All I did was remind people," he said. "The goodness was already there. Sometimes, it just needs a spark." They sat for a while on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. Whitford finally stood and smiled. "Enjoy your peace, my friend. You've earned it." After Whitford's departure, the foundation continued to thrive. Every year, thousands of children received scholarships through For the Future. And though Keanu's name never appeared on a single banner or building, everyone involved knew whose spirit guided the work. Meanwhile, across town, Emily found herself standing on a stage at an awards gala for journalism. Her article, "The Man Who Gave Without Wanting Credit," had just won the National Humanitarian Reporting Award. Cameras flashed and applause filled the hall, but Emily's expression remained calm, almost reverent. When she reached the podium, she took a deep breath and said, "This story was never about celebrity. It was about humanity. About one man who reminded us that compassion doesn't need a microphone." She paused, her voice steady but full of feeling. "In a world that rewards the loud, he taught us that silence can be the highest form of grace." The audience fell silent for a moment before applauding. She smiled softly, then added, "This award isn't mine. It belongs to every nameless giver who decided to make a difference without expecting recognition. They are the real heroes." Later that night, Emily placed the award on Nain, her desk beside Keanu's framed letter. The golden light from her lamp reflected off the glass, illuminating the words she had memorized long ago. Never let kindness become performance. When compassion is quiet, it echoes the loudest. She smiled, whispering to herself, and it's still echoing. The following year arrived quietly, and with it, the next Horizon Foundation Gala. But this time, the event looked nothing like the extravagant display it had once been. The valet line of luxury cars was gone. The red carpet had been replaced by a simple welcome banner that read, "Together, we build tomorrow." The chandeliers still glimmered, but the light in the room came more from the people than from the decorations. Gone were the jeweled gowns and diamond watches, replaced by modest suits and dresses. The crowd had changed too. It wasn't filled with those seeking photographs or headlines, but with volunteers, donors, teachers, and families who had been touched by the foundation's work. Even the tone of conversation was different. People spoke about the projects they were supporting, the students they'd met, the lives they'd helped change. Keanu arrived as he always did, quietly, humbly, driving the same old Ford truck. He parked in the lot like everyone else and walked into the ballroom without announcement. But this time, something was different. Heads turned, not with judgment, but with warmth. Conversations paused, not to gossip, but to greet him with genuine smiles. A young volunteer at the door recognized him and handed him a small program. "Mr. Reeves," she said shyly, "thank you for coming again. It means a lot to all of us." He smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that, but it's me who should be thanking you. You're the ones keeping all this going." As he walked through the room, people approached him, not for autographs or photos, but to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how his quiet example had changed the way they lived. One couple told him they'd sold their second car to fund a youth program. A teacher shared that she'd started a mentorship group for her students. Even the servers and staff smiled at him like an old friend returning home. When the lights dimmed, the crowd settled, and Ryan Huxley, now a member of the foundation's board, took the stage. His demeanor was different from the man of a year ago. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by a kind of stillness that came only from understanding. He began his speech without notes, speaking from the heart. A year ago, this event looked very different. We came here to be seen, to outshine each other, to prove something. But something happened that night, something that changed us all. The audience listened closely, the room silent, except for his voice. "I used to think generosity was about wealth," Ryan continued. "But I've learned it's about heart. It's not about how much you give, it's about how much you care. And no one taught me that better than the man sitting quietly in the back of this room tonight." All eyes turned toward Keanu. He lowered his head slightly, his expression humble as always. Ryan paused for a moment, his voice thick with emotion. "1 year ago, I mocked that man. I laughed at him for arriving alone, for driving an old truck, for sitting quietly while the rest of us boasted about ourselves. I thought success meant being the loudest in the room." He shook his head slowly, his words trembling with honesty. "But I was wrong. The loudest person that night was the quietest one here." His silence spoke louder than all our noise. The audience remained completely still, every eye fixed on him. Ryan continued, "We once laughed at the man who gave quietly. Now, we spend every day trying to follow in his footsteps." Soft applause began, growing stronger until the entire room was standing. People turned toward Keanu, their clapping echoing through the ballroom not with a hollow sound of performance, but with a rhythm of gratitude. Keanu didn't rise or wave. He simply smiled, his eyes warm, his head bowed slightly in acknowledgement. Ryan looked toward him and added, "Keanu didn't just give money, he gave perspective. He reminded us that humility isn't weakness, it's strength. He showed us that success without compassion means nothing, and that giving, when done quietly, can change everything." When the applause faded, Ryan stepped back and gestured toward the screen behind him. A short video began to play, a montage of the foundation's year. Children laughing in classrooms, volunteers rebuilding playgrounds, scholarships being awarded, and families holding hands outside new community centers. Each image was accompanied by simple text, funded by the hearts inspired that night. Keanu watched the screen with a soft smile, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The video ended with a photo from that first gala, the moment Mr. Whitford had announced Keanu's name, and a new caption that read, "The night humility changed everything." When the lights came back on, Emily walked to the podium next. She had been invited to speak not as a journalist, but as a friend of the foundation. Her article, which had continued to ripple around the world, had brought in millions in donations over the past year. But tonight, she didn't talk about the awards or the reach. She talked about the man who made her believe again in good stories. "Keanu once told me something I'll never forget," she began. He said, "Let the story belong to the kids. They're the real stars." I thought I was writing about a celebrity that night, but I realized later that I was writing about something far greater. I was writing about grace. Her voice softened. He didn't change people by preaching. He changed them by being. And now, because of that, this foundation isn't just about giving. It's about gratitude. The applause came again, quieter this time, as if even the crowd knew that words should not overpower what they felt. As the evening wound down, Keanu found himself standing by the same window he had once sat near during the first gala. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping gently against the glass. Ryan walked up beside him, holding 2 glasses of water. "Looks like history repeats itself," he said with a smile. Keanu chuckled. "Maybe it's the universe reminding us to stay grounded." Ryan nodded. "You know, I used to come here to show off. Now I come here to remember." Keanu looked out at the rain-soaked city. "That's what giving does. It helps us remember who we are." Ryan raised his glass. To remembering. Keanu raised his too. To the future. They clinked glasses softly, the sound barely audible over the rain. Behind them, the guests continued to mingle, teachers, students, donors, and volunteers, sharing stories of lives touched and hearts changed. No one boasted. No one competed. It wasn't a gala anymore. It was a gathering of gratitude. And as the night drew to a close, the light from the chandeliers reflected off the rain outside, scattering across the walls like a quiet reminder of what truly mattered: humility, kindness, and the power of a single act of good to change the world forever. The gala had ended hours ago, but the quiet glow of the city remained. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, leaving the streets slick and shining beneath the lamplight. Keanu stepped out of the Horizon Hotel, holding his jacket over one shoulder. The laughter and music inside had faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythm of raindrops and the hum of passing cars. He paused for a moment on the steps, looking up at the night sky. The clouds were breaking, revealing faint stars beyond the mist. For a long time, he simply stood there, letting the cool air touch his face. After everything, the applause, the gratitude, the lives changed, he still felt most at peace in the moments when no one was watching. As he began walking down the street, his thoughts were steady, clear. "Kindness doesn't need applause," he murmured softly to himself. "It needs consistency." His footsteps echoed gently against the wet pavement. The hotel lights faded behind him, swallowed by the vastness of the city. Ahead, he saw a group of volunteers taking down the event banners, their laughter filling the quiet street. He smiled as he passed them, offering a small wave. None of them expected him to help, but he stopped anyway, holding one corner of a sign to keep it from dragging in the puddles. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," one of them said. He shook his head. "No need for that. Just Keanu is fine." When the last banner was rolled up, he handed the volunteer his umbrella and continued on foot. The rain had slowed to a mist, and every light reflected off the pavement like a mirror of 1,000 small stars. Back inside the hotel, the ballroom was empty now. The tables were cleared, the candles snuffed out. The camera panned slowly across the room, stopping at the far wall. There, hanging beneath the foundation's logo, was a new display, a marble panel filled with engraved names. It was called the Scholarship Wall. Each name represented a student whose life had been changed. The camera lingered on it, panning slowly across the rows of names. Some were written in English, others in Spanish, Vietnamese, and dozens of other languages, each one a story. Each one a future that had been made possible, because one man chose humility over fame. As soft piano music began to play, Keanu's voice returned, echoing gently over the final images. "We live in a world that often mistakes noise for purpose," he said. "But real purpose doesn't shout. It listens. It gives. It grows quietly." The screen shifted to show a series of short clips, children running through playgrounds built by the foundation, teenagers in graduation gowns, families holding new keys to homes built through donation programs. The images spoke for themselves, no narration needed. The montage continued, weaving together moments of kindness that stretched far beyond the gala. Volunteers loading trucks with school supplies, teachers in small towns unpacking new computers for their classrooms, doctors treating patients in rural clinics that now bore the Horizon Foundation's modest logo. Every act was quiet, every smile genuine. The music swelled softly as the camera found Sophia, now standing in front of her new classroom. She wore a teacher's lanyard and held a stack of lesson plans. Behind her on the wall was a photo of her graduation day, a reminder of where her journey began. She turned toward the camera, smiling. "Someone believed in me," she said, her voice gentle. "Now I get to believe in others." The scene shifted again. Ryan and Derek stood outside a half-finished community center, wearing construction helmets and volunteer shirts. They were helping pour concrete for a new youth recreation hall. Ryan looked down at the foundation stone, which bore an inscription that read simply, "For the future." He brushed a bit of dust from it and smiled. "He was right," he said softly. "You don't build legacies, you build people." Derek nodded. "And when you do it right, the legacy builds itself." The camera panned up toward the clear blue sky, before cutting to the Horizon Foundation headquarters, where the lobby had been remodeled. The scholarship wall had expanded, now stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with hundreds of names. Above it, a new inscription gleamed in silver lettering, "In honor of the quiet ones who gave without asking to be remembered." The scene faded to Keanu sitting on a park bench overlooking the city at dusk. He watched the skyline shimmer with the first lights of evening, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Birds flew overhead, the last rays of sunset painting the sky in amber and gold. His voice returned once more, calm and reflective. "Kindness isn't a moment," he said. "It's a habit. It's a choice we make every day to care when no one's watching, to listen when no one's speaking, to give when no one's asking." He paused, his gaze following a child playing nearby. The boy tripped, laughed, and stood again, brushing off his knees before running toward his parents. Keanu smiled softly. The best kind of good doesn't need recognition. It just needs to continue. The music slowed, growing quieter, until only the soft hum of strings remained. The camera faded back to the scholarship wall one last time, the engraved names glimmering under the light. A title appeared across the screen. Thousands of lives changed, countless hearts inspired. All because one man believed in giving without being seen. Keanu's voice, now distant, repeated the words he had spoken at the gala a year before. "If doing good needs to be seen, it is no longer good." The screen faded to black. Then, white text appeared slowly across the darkness. Comment. Prompt 1. Have you ever witnessed someone do good without seeking recognition? Comment Prompt 2. What kind of story would you like to see next featuring Keanu Reeves? A few seconds of silence followed before a faint echo of his final words returned, calm and resolute, like a closing prayer. Kindness doesn't need applause. It needs consistency. The soft piano music returned one last time, wrapping the scene in warmth before fading completely. And as the credits rolled, the final quote appeared in white against a black background. glowing like a whisper left behind. If doing good needs to be seen, it is no longer good. The screen lingered for a moment longer before fading out entirely, leaving only stillness, reflection, and the quiet echo of a story that had changed more than lives. It had changed hearts,